Welcome to the Relationship Series podcast. My name is Ankush Jain, and each episode I'll be speaking to a different state of mind expert on the subject of relationships. Enjoy. Welcome to episode 21 of the Relationship Series. This week I'm with author of #1 best-selling book, Instant Motivation. It's Chantal Burns. The subtitle of the book is The Surprising Truth Behind What Really Drives Top Performance. Chantal's worked as a consultant, performance coach and teacher for 16 years. And I've known Chantal right from the start of my own journey into these principles behind state of mind. And the great thing about Chantal is I've always found her to have a real joy for life, a real light personality, and at the same time a real deep understanding of how the mind works and how we experience reality. So I'm really glad to have you on the podcast this week, Chantal. Thanks for coming on board.
Thank you for having me.
So, Chantal, you've recently written a book called Instant Motivation, as I mentioned in the introduction, and we were talking a little bit before we started recording about how you found the relationship chapter in that book was one of the chunkiest chapters. So I'm hoping we're going to have a lot to discuss today. And one of the things that you mention in your chapter is about how we all think differently. We all live in separate realities, as you say in your book. And could you talk a little bit more about what you mean about that as having separate realities?
Well, yeah, I mean, because of the nature of how our thinking works and how the mind works, I'm never going to think what you think. You know, we're the nature of how we operate as human beings is we will always think differently, and knowing that, understanding that, knowing that that's kind of a non-negotiable as a starting point can be really helpful. For people, because I think that one of the issues that really gets in the way, and I've seen this in my own life, many times over the years, and I've seen it with my clients and colleagues and friends and family and pretty much everyone, is that people get very quite protective and defensive and upset if people aren't validating how they're thinking about something, if people aren't thinking the way they're thinking or are not approving of how they're thinking. And so people will spend a lot of time and energy trying to get people to think like they do or to agree that the way they're thinking is the right way. And there's a lot in that, but just to answer your question, I guess, as a starting point, if we understand that, your blue sky is never going to be the same as my blue sky, that we're always going to perceive things differently because of the nature of how thought works, it's a really great foundation and starting point for relationship, because suddenly the idea that you and I have to think the same thing in order for us to be connected, to be in relationship, to be able to make things happen or progress something or fix a problem, that's off the table, and that leaves a space for something new to occur between us in our relationship.
Yeah, and you had a great example in your book about asking people if they thought the problem in their relationship was with them or the other person.
Yeah.
And how most people think it's the other person. And I really enjoyed reading that and seeing you point to that. Do you want to say a bit more about that as well?
Yeah, so it was interesting. That was so quite a long time ago. I asked a group of executives, and it was in a business. And in advance, I sent them a couple of questions. And one of the questions I asked was sort of what's the biggest cause of breakdowns in relationships and communication, and questions about what causes conflict in what's the problem with conflict. And one of the particular questions I asked is when I can't remember exactly what it was because you've got it in front of you and I haven't, but when relationships break down, whose fault is it? Is it other people's listening and other people's attitude, or is it yours? And sort of 80% or some ridiculously huge percentage said it was other people. And only a small percentage said it's me. And I thought it was really cute. It made me smile because, and when I was with them in the room and I said, do you want to hear what the results were? They knew that I could see by the look on their faces, they knew where this was going. And we just laughed because everybody knows, deeply knows that it takes two to make a relationship work, and most executives know that their own listening has something to do with the quality of the connection and the interaction between us. But what's really interesting is that for a lot of people, in their reality, it looks like the problem is with the other person, and if that's how it looks, then we're on it's an upward sort of uphill struggle from the starting point. So again, it comes back to this idea that if we understand that actually how our own thinking and our own mindset, our own way of seeing the world is the thing that's really shaping our relationships from moment to moment, that's just really helpful, because we stop pointing and blaming other people for how we're feeling in a relationship, which is very important. It's important to understand where the source of relationship is.
So let me give you an example of a situation that I came across recently, which is I was speaking to someone I know yesterday, and they've recently quit their job. They've handed in their notice, and the reason they handed in their notice was because the person they were working for, they felt that they weren't listening to them, that they were really struggling, and that person who they worked for, I also know, and I know that a number of people have worked for that person and have left that organisation because they've had the same issue with that person. So I guess the question is there ever an exception to this, or would you say even in that situation, say the person who was struggling, that the employee can still have an impact on that and on that relationship, or are there just certain people who are so not listening, are so wrapped up in themselves or whatever else that doesn't, this is a nice idea but it doesn't always work?
Well, I think the starting point is we have to see that the only thing we ultimately have any true impact and influence on at the most fundamental level is how we experience somebody else, and how we show up in a relationship. But I think what's powerful about that is that how we show up does impact other people. It does, because that connection is always there between us, between human beings. So if we're really settled down about something, that is impacting the energy between us. And now what the other person does with that, who knows? And what I'm not saying is that if somebody's behaving, because I have clients who have relationships with people, whether it's bosses or colleagues or whatever, and for them it's an untenable situation. It's just that the behaviour from the other person is, in their minds, unacceptable. They can't work with that behaviour. Now, what I'm not saying is, well, if you understand how thought works, then you should be able to be okay with any behaviour, or you should be able to work with anyone. It's not quite that simple. I wish it was. What we can do is learn something about where our own experience is coming from, where the source of our sort of emotional life is coming from in relation to that person, and that's really helpful, because that settles us down when we see that any upset or frustrated feelings aren't coming from the other person's behaviour. They're coming from our own thinking in the moment about that behaviour. And that's helpful. That helps you or whoever the person in the situation is to settle down and find maybe some new perspective, some clarity, some fresh thinking about that situation, and to really be able to, most importantly, access their kind of common sense and wisdom. And your wisdom might say, get the hell out of this relationship. This is not somebody you want to spend time with. This isn't good for you. And if that's kind of guided by wisdom and common sense, great. And we can only really. This is obviously just this is how I see it. This is just my perspective. But I think that if I am seeing in the moment where my experience is coming from, where my feelings are being generated from, and I'm not blaming the other person for how I feel, that allows me to see the situation and to be able to, I don't know, have a different way of relating to that person without all of that judgmental and upsetting, concerned thinking. And from that place, I may see something that might be helpful for that other person, or I might realise that I don't really want to spend more time with that person. I don't know what I'm going to see. I don't know what fresh thinking I'm going to get. I just know that I'm in the best place to be able to handle those challenges in a relationship and be of service to the other person if I'm seeing things clearly. So that's always that's what comes to mind when you ask that question. It's not that we can control or manage other people's behaviour, but to see that their behaviour isn't really the ultimate issue that's at the heart of our experience, that's very helpful.
You said there that if you can see where your feelings are coming from, that would be, and I'm paraphrasing, that would be helpful. Where would you say that our feelings are coming from?
Well, I would say that all the emotional content of our experience. So all. I mean, when I say feelings and emotions, they're the same thing in my mind. All of that emotional content can only come from one place, which is thought. The thinking that I'm having in any moment is going to give rise to a particular emotional response in the system. Whether that shows up as me kind of, I don't know, I'm feeling very warm or feeling shaky or panicky, or whether I can identify a particular feeling, like a sad feeling or an anxious feeling. It might show up in different ways, but any emotional response that I have, whilst it might look like it's coming from the person in front of me, from the situation, from an issue with the relationship, that's not where it's coming from. One of the things I say in my book is that we often think we're dealing with people issues, that relationship problems are a sort of a people problem, but in reality it's a paradigm problem, not a people problem, and that's a very different way to understand relationship.
Yeah, and I know that in your book you talked about the fact that it looks like situations or circumstances either impact or cause our feelings, but they really don't. And that's what I heard you just reiterate there. Yeah,
and that's really at the heart of most of the relationship issues we have, in the workplace, whether it's, conflict or, people not seeing the bigger picture and people being very sort of protective or defensive, people withholding information. There's all sorts of issues that we see in the workplace around relationships, and all of that we can trace back to a fundamental issue with our kind of worldview or our understanding about our own experience and where our feelings come from. If it makes sense, it's logical that if somebody is in a work situation, for example, where a lot of my client work is in organisations, if somebody feels that the source of their upset or their stress or their anxiety or their inability to do their job properly is a function of someone else's behaviour, or that that they can't be okay until that other person changes, which is very common, that's going to create a lot of additional problematic issues around the work situation or around that relationship. But as soon as that person sees that actually that other individual, their behaviour's really got nothing to do with my felt experience right now, my mood or my feelings of upset or anxiety or frustration, as soon as they see that can only be coming from my thinking, it can only be coming from how I'm perceiving and thinking about the situation right now, that's helpful, because suddenly all of that thinking that we might be engaging in relation to trying to control or manage or move away from the other person's behaviour is no longer, sort of falls away. It's no longer relevant when we see where our experience is really coming from. And that creates a whole sort of that creates a space, it creates headspace, it creates room for us to be able to think more clearly, and it also really helps us to connect more deeply with the other person, because the first thing that happens when relationships break down is the connection's not there, and there's a trust issue, and when that's not there, it's very hard to move forwards, without that connection.
Yeah. You said in your book, you mentioned connection there, you said in your book that connection is always there.
Yeah, I'm almost contradicting myself. Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. At the most fundamental level, we're all connected. We are all connected. We're made of the same stuff. We're made of the same energy. We are connected. And sometimes, I wrote about this, and sometimes it can sound a bit sort of esoteric or existential, but it's true. That's how it works. Scientists will back that up, that we are ultimately connected. So the only thing that can break the feeling of connection is our own thinking in the moment and how we are perceiving the situation. And we can only perceive a situation by how we're thinking about a situation. And that's going to create our feelings about the situation. So it feels like there's a lack of connection, but at the most fundamental level, yes, we're always connected.
You're talking a lot about corporate relationships, but it just occurs to me this is extremely similar to any kind of relationship, whether it's romantic relationships or friendships or anything else.
Yes, it is. I mean, I used to spend. I used to put so much effort into. I used to get so upset if people didn't think like me, or if people didn't want to weren't aligned with how I saw the world, and that was very much something that happened in relationships. That was in personal relationships, with in intimate relationships, that it seemed like, well, if we don't think the same way, how can we're not compatible. We can't. I saw that as a compatibility issue. It's funny, I've never thought about that until now. But yeah, it's like, well, if you don't think like me, then we're clearly not compatible, so we can't be together. Which is that's a really innocent misunderstanding. It's so innocent. I look back and I think, oh gosh, but that really made sense to me back then. And now the issues of compatibility are way deeper than whether someone thinks the same way as me or not. There's a much deeper level of connection that, for me, is what creates compatibility. So suddenly, understanding more about where our experience comes from and understanding more about this kind of thought-feeling connection, it really changes the game for relationships. It creates so much more freedom between people. It creates, like, the idea of being tolerant or seeing things through someone else's eyes, that sort of becomes a natural byproduct of understanding where our experience comes from. If we understand that the nature of nature is that we are going to think differently, I'm never going to have the same thoughts that you're going to have about something. We're just not, because that's how the system works. Then as soon as I am okay with that, because I realise, well, that's how it works, so I can try and fight against that, or I can just understand that that's how it is. I can start to really enjoy that diversity. I can enjoy that difference. That becomes something beautiful and interesting and something worth exploring, rather than something that needs to be fixed because it's not broken, because we're meant to think differently, because that's how it works. It's how we're built. It's part of nature's design.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, that I remember, I don't know who it was, but someone saying that when you first enter a romantic relationship, everything that is the same with another person, you're like, oh, we're so similar. And then everything that's different we find really cute and endearing.
Yeah.
And then it can be a few years later or whenever, at a certain point later, the same things that we found cute and endearing, or how compatible two people are the things that start to annoy us.
Exactly.
But nothing's actually changed.
No, exactly. And because our feelings, our experience of them wasn't really coming from the behaviour in the first place. That's why we can think that a behaviour is cute and endearing one minute and the most irritating thing the next minute. I mean, I see that so much with my own partner, that, you know, he can do something really that seems really cute. Like when I was writing the book, he would come home from work, because I've got an office outside, and so I was in a separate building, and he would come home from work and he would come out to my office and he would very kindly bring me a cup of tea, you know, because he knew I'd probably been working long hours, and sometimes my response would be, oh, sweetie, you're just the best, that's so cute, that's so lovely. And then that exact same behaviour, him bringing me in a cup of tea another time, would be, can you knock first? I was in flow. Don't you realise this is really important? Just the exact same thing. I would be the poor guy. No wonder he wasn't sure what to do for the best, because I was a bit schizophrenic in my response to him. And that's what we do. And there's a reason for that. It's, you know, our thinking fluctuates. And along with that fluctuation comes a fluctuation in feeling and perception, and the very same thing can look very, very different coming from a different state of mind, or a different thinking, feeling state. And understanding that is very, very helpful. And then that means that it's very helpful for example, for my partner, because he knows that that's really not about him. So he's freed up too. So he can keep bringing tea, or he can stop bringing tea, but ultimately he understands that it isn't really whether he brought the tea or not. That was just where I was in that moment. And so we don't have to... That upset or that friction is over so quickly, and that's another benefit of understanding more about our experience, is that we can recover from upset in relationship really fast.
And it occurs to me that can also make us more empathetic and lead to more empathy. And again, that was something that I picked up from the chapter you wrote about.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed over the years, and I used to do this, you know, I used to, sort of many, many years ago, I would teach people the importance of seeing things through someone else's eyes, I would teach people about the process of being empathetic. And what's really interesting is that as soon as I started to see more deeply the true nature of being human, of that we naturally, as I've said a few times, that we naturally are going to see the world differently, and that's that's always going to be an ever-present sort of characteristic of every relationship. What I started to notice with myself and with my clients is that you start to naturally have more empathy, because you start to realise that on one level we're all the same. We're all thinking, feeling beings. We're all in this, beautiful, intelligent system. We're all made of the same stuff. We're all in our own kind of little thought-feeling bubbles, if you like. And we're all experiencing our own thinking coming to life inside of us as an emotion or some kind of, response. And we're all doing that. And seeing that, the more deeply I see that, the more compassion I feel towards other people, regardless of what they're saying or what they're doing. Because I realise, well, we're the same. And yeah, I get upset too, and yeah, I get defensive too, and yeah, I get frustrated too, and all of those things. Or I can see that at one level, that we're all the same, and that those differences are actually what make us human, and that really helps to foster the connection. And so no one needs to tell me to be more empathetic. Actually, and I don't need to teach people to have more empathy. All I need to do is help people see where their experience and their feelings are coming from in relation to other people. And something about understanding the bigger system that we're operating from, the kind of implication or byproduct of that is that we do start to feel more connected to others and to have more compassion. And that makes sense to me now. And that's great, because it means we don't have to do a 6-step process on how to get connected to another person. We just have to see we're already connected, and we're innocently obscuring that connection with our own thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that so many articles, books, courses, whatever out there seem to focus on behaviours, whether it's empathy, whether it's better listening, whether it's deeper rapport, or something else in terms of improving relationships. But what you're pointing to is that actually having a deeper understanding of how we experience life, how we create our experience, our felt experience through thought, leads to more of those behaviours that everyone is taking courses to get. You're yes. saying that's a natural implication of that.
Yeah, yes. And it's interesting, I was visiting a sort of a friend and client recently, and I was listening to her talking to other people about how her relationships have changed and how they've transformed, all her relationships. And it was interesting when I heard her say, including my relationship with myself. Because, of course, in a way, the biggest relationship we're in is our relationship with ourselves. And sometimes that's the relationship we need to attend to. People will often be very kind with other people and not so kind with themselves. So our relationship with ourselves, and we could have a whole conversation about self and what that means, but fundamentally there is that relationship going on too. And one of the things, when I was writing the book and I was reflecting on this, and I was writing the relationship chapter, and I was really reflecting deeply about this, and one of the things that I saw was, well, the ultimate relationship that we're in is a relationship with thought. It looks, and I don't know how this is going to sound, but it seems like I'm in a relationship with you, Kush, but actually I'm really in a relationship with my own thoughts and feelings about my relationship with you or about you. So seeing that that's the same for all of us, that the first most fundamental level of relationship is sort of the relationship we have with our own experience about someone, rather than with that person directly, is also helpful to see.
Yeah, you just reminded me that a conversation I had this weekend. I was leading a training course, and at one point I talked about forgiveness. And what's been really interesting for me is that, like you say, we can be kind to other people, and even with forgiveness, we can, we think we can forgive other people, potentially.
Mm.
And for me, what was a really surprising byproduct, or something that I hadn't had eyes for before, was forgiving myself.
Mm.
And I mean, we haven't talked about this so far, but I guess an implication of what you're talking about is getting lost in thought, and it's a moment-to-moment thing, and sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't, as you said with your partner, is that there's a real innocence there.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
And the innocence isn't just in the other person, it's in ourselves.
Mm. Yes, exactly, yeah. Yeah, that's lovely. I love that, yes. Yes, we're all the same in that regard. I think Sid Banks in a tape or in one of his books said, that we're psychologically innocent. And I never really understood what that meant until I saw something deeper about the nature of being in our own sort of subjective realities. Was, well, we're all going to be in the feeling that our thinking is creating moment to moment. We're all going to be living in the sort of emotional response or feeling that our thinking is creating moment to moment. And our behaviours are an outward expression of whatever that thought, feeling, experience is. We're going to act out of or not, but often, any behaviour is going to arise and be a reflection of our state of mind, of our thoughts and feelings in that moment. And so, whatever behaviour, whatever we're doing in that moment, it to that person or to ourselves, it makes sense in that moment based on how we're thinking and feeling. And then as soon as we understand, if in that moment we've been attributing our feelings to something other than our own thinking, it's going to lead us astray. And so our behaviours are going to be based on a false filter or a flawed understanding of how life works. And that's the same for all of us. So I have more appreciation for this notion of us being psychologically innocent. Is we do the best we can do based on the thinking we're doing in any given moment. We can only live at the level of thinking we're at any moment. That's all we've got going for us. And it's the same for all of us. And an appreciation for that in ourselves and others is really, again, very very helpful.
So one thing I wanted to cover, and I know you did too, was listening. And I know in your book you said that you thought you were a good listener, and now that's very different. So I'm really curious to hear kind of what changed. What was your own personal experience of listening, and what changed that to get to where you are now as a listener?
Well, sometimes I'm still a shocking listener. Sometimes I catch myself and I realise that I'm not really listening. I'm not really present, to another person, to the other person. And I see this show up a lot. In business, I see this show up, but for me personally, I see this show up a lot in my relationship. I think it's really easy when we know people, or we think we know people, we get into this I already know them, or I already know what they're going to say. Listening, I call it. I already know listening, and it's, again, that's quite innocent. We get into habits of thinking, which means we get into habits of listening, because our listening, again, is a function of how we see the world, of our worldview. If I see something really fundamental about how life works, it's going to change how I listen to life. It's going to change how I listen to myself and how I listen to other people. And so when I talked about that I used to be a really good listener, it was because I'd been trained to listen in a particular way. I'd learnt to listen actively, and to make all the right noises, and to really focus on what another person was saying. But there wasn't very much about connection in that. It was a very transactional thing. If I can repeat back what they said, then I've listened well. If I can remember everything I need to say by the time they finish speaking, then I've listened well. Which is not, for me now, listening is it's not about the ears. Listening is a whole body, whole mind, whole body experience. It's about really being in connection, really being able to get a sense of where someone else is coming from, being open, and being loving, being compassionate. For me, that's all part of listening. So listening has gone from being a thing that I do, a skill, a competency, a thing, to being everything. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, I love that. We're really quickly running out of time, but I've got one more question for you, which is, again, love. And we could talk for an hours, and I know people have talked about love and tried to describe it and all the rest of it for centuries and millennia, but does love have a place in the workplace?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And again, I talk about this in the book, and I explore this with my clients all the time. It's a little bit like listening in that love, for me, love isn't a thing. Love is a state of being. It's a state of consciousness. So in some ways, I would say that we're made of love. It's one of the fundamental ingredients of it's what we're made of. It's part of our design. So love is often talked about as something we need to do. But I think I keep seeing that there's something deeper about seeing our true nature, the true nature of being human, is that love is the foundation of humanity, of being human. And when we see that I don't know, it just, again, it opens up a different space in relationship with people. I think that there was an interesting piece of research done with I think it was in Harvard, and again, I talk about it in the book, where they were looking at the importance of compassion in the workplace, and they found that, not surprisingly, a workplace that has more love and compassion at its core, where they made that really important, an important part of the workplace, people thrive and flourish. And that doesn't surprise me. I think that we when we're in a loving feeling, and when we're in that space with another person, it's magical, and it allows us to deal with whatever we need to deal with, if we can be with somebody and have that connection. And I think love is just another way of talking about that ever-present connection that we have with each other.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when you think about it, it makes you'd think, why would it be any other way? and taking the opposite of that, if you had an organisation where there was zero compassion, zero love and understanding, it wouldn't be a very nice place to work, and I'm sure the results would show through in that as well.
Well, and I think that I suppose one other thing about that is that I think in the sort of business world, the idea of love and compassion, and even the whole sort of the emotional intelligence piece, used to be seen as sort of something soft and fluffy, and but actually it's not that at all. It's when we look at how people really thrive at work and the environment in which they can do their best work, it's always going to be an environment where people feel really connected, where people feel really appreciated, where people feel loved. Just like we thrive at home and in our personal lives in a feeling of love and connection. Why should it be any different at work? It's no different. It's just that we've been living in an old paradigm in terms of our understanding about what makes effective and flourishing workplace, and thankfully now that's changing, and people are starting to see that if we put love at the heart, excuse the pun, love at the heart of the workplace, that's going to have some very profound implications for people's ability to be able to perform at their best and do their best work.
Yeah. Well, we've run out of time, Chantal. It's absolutely flown by as always. If people want to find out more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Via my website, which is chantalburns.com, and also people can email me at chantal@starconsultancy, starconsultancy.com.
And I would encourage everyone to get the book Instant Motivation, The Surprising Truth Behind What Really Drives Top Performance. I'm sure all good bookshops and Amazon, no doubt. I really enjoyed it. You've got a mix of scientific kind of studies in there and people's stories. So highly recommended. For people who want to find out more about myself, you can do that via my website, which is www.ankushjain.co.uk. Find me on Facebook at facebook.com/AnkushJain Ltd, and on Twitter, which is at AnkushKJain. Thanks, Chantal. It's been a pleasure talking to you. This was the Relationship Series podcast. If you like this episode, please share it and leave us your feedback online. Thanks for listening.